Hey, it's Alex from Way Back History. I want to show you something today that I put together, which helps to address a topic that I've touched on briefly in the past, but I haven't really gone into any detail about. I mentioned it briefly at the beginning of the Morocco video, but basically this is the premise. Our goal is, in these history videos, to give you straight up the facts, who's in control of an area on the ground at a given time, without any political bias or favoritism for one side or the other. And that standard's been applied throughout the videos. So transferring that to today's world, you certainly have to analyze today's world the exact same way to have an accurate depiction of it. The only qualification for inclusion on the map has to be territorial control of an area at a given time. Anything else is just a political interpretation, favoring one side or the other. Now, I do understand why we have our normal style of maps that we're used to seeing every day, because maps that are printed in a certain country are going to usually be required to have those countries' political views implanted in them. We've seen this happen especially recently in communist China with some of its maps, but we saw this in America during the Cold War with the Baltic states and various other examples. Now you see that obviously with Crimea, the Donbass, and various other current events that are represented on American maps the way that whoever the current American administration wants them represented, and they're represented on other countries' maps the way that those countries interpret the current situation. But in order to cut through all that political BS, for lack of a better word, you just have to represent territorial control, see the facts on the ground, and then decide for yourself who's at fault and who to blame and all that. But basically, as long as you're getting the facts up front, then you can decide for yourself. Our mission here at Way Back History is to give you those facts up front so you can draw your own conclusions about history, but I also want to give you the same level of insight into today's world, and this does open up the possibility of maybe covering some current or more recent conflicts, in addition to serving as a present-day map and also a template for regular videos, such as the Morocco example I showed earlier. So I am fired up about the possibilities this project opens up, and this was something I'd wanted to do for a long time as a companion to the regular videos and just didn't get around to it. But like I said, this map can serve as a basis for future history videos, as well as serving as a tool to more intelligently analyze our current world. Of course, that'll be after we finish our Collapse of Austria-Hungary series, which will have episode 3 coming out hopefully later this week or early next week. So you're going to want to stay tuned to Way Back History for that, and also check out episodes 1 and 2 over on our channel page. And while you're there, don't forget to hit the bell button and subscribe. So what are you looking at here? The Apolitical World Map. It's basically the same premise as the regional maps during our videos. It's based on realpolitik, and any borders or factions represented are entirely based on territorial control on a given date. As I mentioned earlier, this is really the only effective way to cut through the political bias of individual countries with their claims and recognition, and therefore get a real and unbiased picture of the situation on the ground. I just want to run through a couple examples here to show you exactly what I'm talking about. By the way, the link to the full version of the map is in the description and down in the comments, so be sure to check that out, explore the full map, and maybe follow along with a couple of my examples here. You'll notice that I didn't include Antarctica, and that's because there really is no clear situation on the ground there, while those countries that do have outposts there often overstep their claims. This despite the fact that every country has sworn off doing just that. So besides Antarctica, every other inhabited or semi-inhabited territory in the world is on here. And let's take a look at Yemen, because I think that Yemen is a situation that a lot of people in the world, especially in Europe and in America, find confusing. It's a civil war, which means the warring factions don't appear on ordinary maps. However, Yemen has not been a united country since 2014 and has been split in 3 for much of the last 2 years. This map is able to display exactly what factions are in control and who you should look up, although there is a weakness, and that's that I could not find a concise and coherent way to display the militia groups in control of various areas of the world, including in Yemen. Now, the Islamic State obviously makes it easy, as like the Taliban does in Afghanistan, they proclaim a state in their conquered areas, whereas many other militias in the world, including Islamists, communists, and other rebels, control territory but do not proclaim a government in those areas. So I did try at first labeling them like factions that have a government, but it didn't really work because a lot of them don't have a flag, none of them proclaim a state, so in the end they're all listed as factions that don't declare a government. And in the case of Yemen, the areas you see labeled this way are occupied presently by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now this map gives us some real insight because you can basically tell the situation. The UAE-backed Southern Movement controls most of the southern part of the country. Much of the north of the country is controlled by the Iranian-backed Houthis and their Supreme Political Council, while the Saudi-backed Hadi government, which I believe is the internationally recognized government, shows you how much that means, controls just a coastal strip in the west and then large stretches of deserts in the northeast. They also cling to a strip on Socotra, which is mainly under southern control. However, a couple of years ago, they were able to successfully force the UAE troops that had come in to bolster the South Yemen troops off the island. However, the UAE backing for South Yemen's position on the island remains strong. Not every complicated situation is made this much easier to understand by the map, but this is just a great illustration of how this lowers the barrier to entry to understand geopolitics, and that's really what we're going for here. Let's slide over to Afghanistan, because that's a situation that is made no less complicated by the map. It's certainly very complicated, but it does a good job of showing you exactly why this war has gone on for so long and why it shows no signs of stopping anytime soon except for a possible ceasefire or peace deal. But it appears no side is going to win this outright. This would be a very interesting one to go into for a future video because of obviously everything that happened with 9/11 and everything that came out of this war. But basically it goes all the way back to when the Soviets first invaded the country in the 80s and hasn't stopped since. Going back and looking at this area during the 90s would be a very good way of kind of explaining the lead up to the bombing of the USS Cole, bombing of American embassies, and eventually, of course, 9/11. But that would be a very interesting video to do. So maybe we'll put that one on the table going forward. This war also shows the upside of the labeling issue that I was talking about before, because here the militia faction you see near the Pakistani-Afghan border is called the Taliban, or at least they call themselves the Taliban, but they're not related to the Afghan Taliban, which is the group in control of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is the state they proclaim, and are backed by the Pakistani government under the table. While this Pakistani group using that Taliban name actually fights against the Pakistani government. So in this case, it really works out that all the territories in this category are labeled this way. Now, there are a few conflicts in the world, of course, that this map doesn't really do a better job of explaining, and we'll just briefly take a look at one of those because we do want to be honest and upfront here. Over in Southeast Asia, the map does actually do a good job here of clearing up the Myanmar-Burma controversy, as the country is currently known as Myanmar in English. It also does a good job of showing the status of the rebellious states in the east, where rebel groups have held military strongholds for years, but it does not do a good job of illustrating the Rohingya Muslim refugee crisis in the southwest portion of the country along the border with Bangladesh. And the reason for that, unfortunately, is of course the widespread ethnic cleansing in that region, which has prevented any rebel state from taking shape. Most Rohingya civilians were viewed as potential rebels and expelled from the country with violent force. A tragedy, of course, of the highest order. But it's also something that's very difficult to illustrate in map form without a map being specifically about that issue. So unfortunately, on the Apolitical world map, there's not really anything to indicate it. But I definitely feel with the people there, and I think it's an important conflict to study. We could do a future video about it. Of course, if we were doing a video about the specific area, we wouldn't have the limitations of the world map, and that definitely is an underreported on and undercovered topic. So maybe that's something we'll do a video on in the future. Now, of course, one of the main topics of the map is dispelling the notion of disputed control. But there is one region in the world where the situation was so complicated that it proved simply impossible to label any other way besides explaining the territorial dispute. And I'm, of course, talking about the Spratly Islands, also in Southeast Asia, in the southern portion of the South China Sea. It's still not a perfect explanation of the disputes in the area, as for example, the Republic of China, or Taiwan, only has 2 outposts in the Spratlys, but it has the largest, while many of Communist China's outposts in the area are actually on artificial islands. However, the most recent up-to-date numbers of total outposts is what I decided to list, and in this case, too, a full video with a more detailed map is probably a better way of explaining this than looking at the world map anyway, so for the world map, this works out without going into too much detail. Something else I think the map helps display is the territorial coherence of remote island countries and also archipelago countries. Take a look here at some of the oceanic countries. This is one of those areas that's difficult to display both on a normal globe and on something like Google Maps. If you look on either one of them, you'll normally find these countries to be labeled in a somewhat different or incoherent fashion, or oftentimes not labeled at all, especially when it comes to outlying islands of these countries. And it also does a good job of illustrating foreign controlled areas, such such as British, French, or American possessions, or simply the outlying regions of other island countries that I talked about earlier. This definitely also applies to the Caribbean, where of course the largest remaining stronghold of overseas possessions is located. Now, whether the territory is an external possession of the power or is an integral part of the state proper is mostly indicated in the name of the territory, which is located, of course, in the text label. So a territory doesn't have to be a separate entity to be labeled separately here. It just has to be separated from the main body of the country. And it's totally consistently applied all the way across the board. Again, total consistency to give the greatest amount of accuracy. So you see here, I have Hawaii and Alaska labeled the same way. And if an overseas territory does have its own flag, I've gone ahead and used that. If not, and they just use the flag of the possessing power, then I've done that too. So I hope to be able to update this about every 6 months. If we can get about 2 editions a year, that would be pretty good. This particular one is dated to May 1st, so we'll be looking to create an updated edition of the map toward the end of the year, and maybe we'll do another video like this to go along with it and show the changes that have happened in the world over the next 6 months. So be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check out our channel page for episodes 1 and 2, The Collapse of Austria-Hungary, or any of our other videos, and be sure to check out episode 3 coming soon here on Way Back History. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, the link to the full map is in the description and down in the comments. I am Alex. See you next time.